Look, President Obama and this administration, their approach to radical Islam has been bizarre. They refuse to acknowledge it for what it is, and they refuse to call it by its name. There is a consistent unifying ideology between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, between Khomeini and Iran, between Boko Haram, between the Taliban and Pakistan. They are all radical Islamic terrorists. And we are not going to be able to defeat radical Islamic terrorism with a president who's unwilling to utter those words, radical Islamic terrorism. He won't say it, his administration won't say it. They will not acknowledge that there are theocratic radicals who have declared war, declared jihad on America. That's another word the president never says is jihad. And instead we have this bizarre Orwellian doublespeak. So that a few weeks ago in Paris, with the horrible terrorist attack that occurred there, the president said it was a random act of violence. Nothing random about it when radical Islamists went into a kosher deli to murder Jews because of their Jewish faith. It is one manifestation of rising anti-Semitism across Europe. Likewise, when we saw just a few days ago, 21 Coptic Christians in Egypt beheaded by ISIS. And the president stood up and said ISIS murdered 21 Egyptian citizens, omitting the fact that they were Christians. They were not citizens at random. They were targeted because of their faith, and it is because these are radical Islamic terrorism, and we need to stop the doublespeak. You know, the definition of an apologist is someone who makes an explanation, gives rationalizations, explains the conduct of others. And it is deeply counterproductive to have President Obama standing up as an apologist for radical Islamic terrorists. How do we know he's doing that? Just a few weeks ago at the National Prayer Breakfast, the president stood up, briefly mentioned the horrific terror attacks of ISIS, but then promptly analogized them to the Crusades. The Crusades began over 1,000 years ago. They ended 700 years ago. I don't think it's too much to ask to expect the president to stay in the current millennium. And that analogy, by the way, it's an analogy that terrorists like. It's an analogy that radical Islamic terrorists use all the time. And when the president says, well, gosh, all religions are equally culpable, you know what? I'm a Christian. If Christians today were seeking out and murdering those who don't share their religious faith because they don't share their religious faith, I would happily call them out for that. If Jews today were seeking out and murdering those who don't share their Jewish faith because of that, I would happily call them out, but they're not right now. And there is a bizarre moral relativism to say because there have been bad actors of other faiths across the centuries, it's all part and parcel of the same thing. It is a holy war being waged by radical Islamic terrorists, not by all Muslims. There are hundreds of millions of peaceable Muslims across the world. But for the radical Islamic terrorists, it is a jihad, a holy war from their perspective. And to counter it, we have to acknowledge what it is and fight it. You know, about 5 years ago, Major Nidal Hassan murdered 14 innocent souls at Fort Hood. As he walked through Fort Hood shooting them, he called out, Allahu Akbar. He did it after communicating with a radical Islamic cleric about the permissibility of waging jihad against fellow soldiers. And yet what happened? The Obama administration refused to acknowledge that was terrorism. Instead, they characterized it as workplace violence. Now that's nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. One of the things I was very grateful to do is in the Senate, I introduced legislation to finally provide that those men and women that were murdered by Hassan would be eligible for the Purple Heart. The military had denied it because it wasn't deemed terrorist, and it took an act of Congress to change that.